And welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, available on Pacifica Radio Network and iTunes and Stitcher and SoundCloud and Progressive Radio Network and at opednews.com/podcasts and on YouTube. My guest for the show is Paul Craig Roberts. He's coming back after being on the show many times. Dr. Roberts was Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury for Economic Policy in the Reagan administration. He was Associate Editor and columnist with the Wall Street Journal, columnist for Business Week and the Scripps Howard News Service. He's a contributing editor to Gerald Celente's Trends Journal. He's had numerous university appointments. His books include The Failure of Laissez-Faire Capitalism and Economic Dissolution of the West, How America Was Lost, and the Neoconservative Threat to International Order, Washington's Perilous War for Hegemony. Great to have you back.
Glad to be here.
These are insane, crazy times like I'm sure you or I certainly haven't seen anything like them before.
That's for sure.
Yeah. I wrote a piece today saying that what we're seeing here is worse than if the U.S. was invaded by a foreign power.
I agree.
And
I agree. Yeah.
It's going to get worse. So before we went live, you said you're preparing for this. What are you doing?
Let's just get into the subject. I'm just trying to get all my affairs in order and everything, you know.
Okay. Well, you wrote an article, Economic Effect of Coronavirus Could Be Revolutionary. And you said that coronavirus will teach us that a country without free national health care is severely handicapped. You're talking about single payer. You're talking about what Bernie Sanders is talking about.
Yeah, I've been talking about it for some time. The single payer has every advantage. It's much cheaper because in the system we have, there's profit built in at every level. So, you know, a huge part of the cost of our system is profit. And that is taken out in national health systems. And the other problem with our system is there's so many uncovered people, and even people who are covered, a lot of them can't afford the co-pays and the deductions, or even the premiums. You know, the Obamacare, all it does is subsidizes in part premiums for the very poorest people. And the other feature it has is you can't be refused coverage on the basis of existing conditions. So, but it's not anything like what we need. It's not a single payer system, and it doesn't really change what we had enough to really be important. So we really need to move to a single payer system, which simply means the government provides national health care on demand, and it's paid for by the payroll tax. So that's essentially what we have to have. And not having it now, we have a situation where there are millions and millions of people not covered. If they get sick, what are they going to do?
Yeah, and the ones who are covered, many are covered with the insurance from the job, and a lot of those are losing their jobs right now. I mean, I figured that at least 8 million people or 18 million people are going to be put out of work by the closings that are happening right now.
That could be the case, yeah.
Yeah, and you say that it will deny income to millions of people, and it's going to produce a frightening scenario. What have you thought through in terms of what that scenario looks like?
Well, a lot of desperate people with nothing to lose. They've got no job, no income, no food. They can't service their debts, pay their bills, and they're ill. And they got no health care. That's catastrophe.
Yeah, it's like we've been watching these post-apocalyptic movies and TV shows for 20 years. It's like they prepared us for what we're going through right now.
It could. That's the scary part. It could actually develop in that way. The public authorities, are they capable of providing food to tens of millions of people and health care? It's quite a frightening situation, and so that's I don't want to dwell on it and get everybody else scared up, but you can think along your own lines. What do? You've lost your job. look, a large percentage of Americans live hand to mouth. They live paycheck to paycheck. And that living has also been supported by debts. They got mortgages, they got car payments, they got credit card debt. And so they really don't have any disposable income, net disposable income, after they service their debts. And so, the Fed, we've talked about this before, Rob, the Fed a while back published a study that something like 40% of the population couldn't raise $400 cash. So this is not a situation that can deal with a pandemic. And this is what unregulated, mindless capitalism produces.
You've also talked in your article about how globalism has taken down the ladders of upward mobility and reduced the survivability of our society.
Right. What globalism really means for the United States or the first world in general is high value added, high productivity jobs that pay high wages are moved offshore where wages are cheap. So, we've had millions of American manufacturing jobs moved to Asia. Lots of software engineering jobs moved to Asia. All kinds of, any kind of high productivity, high value added job, the corporations move them offshore because the wages there have been, so much lower than they were in the United States. So what happens to the people who had those jobs? They don't get new jobs with equivalent salaries. So their incomes take hits. And so this shrinks the domestic purchasing power, the aggregate demand in the economy. That shrinks. So in the end, the corporations, by moving jobs offshore, essentially destroy their home market. Because when you move those jobs offshore, you're moving American consumer income to Asia. So now the Asians are making the stuff that our own firms sell to us. So that's a disconnect between the production of goods and the income of the people. The goods that American firms sell us are produced in China. The Chinese are paid wages, and they bring the goods here to sell us, but we don't have the wages associated with that production. So that's minus. Also, it makes you dependent on foreign supplies. For example, we're heavily dependent on China and India for medicines. India, there's some sign now that India is starting to restrict the export of the medicines, just gearing up themselves for what may hit them. So you're vulnerable there, you see. You don't have any domestic supply chains. Your supply chains are coming in from abroad. So disruption abroad disrupts you. And we haven't earned any friends in these years, sanctions, threats, invasions. India was going to buy some weapon systems from Russia. We got all mad, threatened them. Look, all the threats we put on China, we depended on China for medicine.
And so bottom line, what you're saying is our dive deep into globalism has made us much more vulnerable and put us much more at risk, particularly now when we need all the friends we can get. So what do you think about the leadership on how the coronavirus has been handled in terms of the virus, in terms of the economy, in terms of the people?
Well, I think it's not been successful. They should have very quickly stopped air flights. Instead, they continued, and they kept letting people come in from these affected areas. They didn't test them when they arrived. And so that's how it moves into community spread. And when it moves into community spread, it's very difficult to control except with extreme measures. Now, as I understand the policy for now, ours in England are different from Europe. Europe has gone into lockdown, and apparently the United States and the UK are going to just continue operating and hope people use precautions and and self-isolate the elderly. So those are two different ways of approaching it. The European way is going to cause a lot of business failures. How does the local businesses and restaurants and all of that continue to exist when they're closed?
Well, but that's happened today. I mean, state by state, they're shutting down restaurants, gyms, theaters, anything that's non-essential business.
Well, if we follow that practice, you not only have the health threat, you have an accelerated or intensified, I should say, economic effect. And so, it's how does the government deal with this? I mean, they would have to simply just start issuing paychecks to all the people who are unemployed, and they would have to just start freely providing care for coronavirus patients. So they would already have to start doing things they've never done. They've got to have a generalized welfare system and a generalized medical system. Now, of course, I said a free one, but it's not free. You have to pay for it, but it's free on use. It's people are paying for it through payroll taxes, but it's free on use. Well, the government now will have to pay for it just by printing money. So they print huge sums of money to save a few big banks, to save the financial system.
That was what I was going to ask you next. They've released what, close to $2 trillion already?
I think, yeah. I think the initial one was was 1.5 trillion, and there've been others, and they drop interest rates, and this is to prevent the big financial institutions from collapsing, which of course would be bad. There's no doubt about it in this type of circumstance. So they let these banks get too big because they stopped enforcing the antitrust laws, and they just let merger after merger after merger. And what is the sense of having two giant banks like J.P. Morgan and Chase Manhattan merged?
But as you're saying it, I'm thinking, damn, should I go to the bank and take out some serious money because I might not be able to have it soon?
I have no idea. I think if they do that, then they're going to have millions of roaming mobs to try to control. They're going people are going to have the ability to pay their bills and provide food, and it's just hard to know what they're going to do. They don't strike me as thoughtful. Look, we've wasted. Since Clinton, we've wasted all these presidencies fighting wars we had no need for and no reason for, and built up huge debts and huge government debts on top of all the private debts. Now, the government can always pay its own debt by printing the money and buying bonds, but states can't, cities can't, individuals can't, companies can't. So the government has been very generous in bailing out the big banks, the big New York banks, and all of the people who financialize the economy. You see, Rob, for decades, or let's say at least, for a long time, banks don't lend anymore for new plant and equipment for productive purposes. They lend for leveraged buyouts. They lend so people can buy up financial paper, financial assets. So you've got all that debt, but it did not expand the productive base. It expanded speculation on paper asset values.
Which is basically what happened in 2008, too.
Yeah, and it's continued, see, and it's even, I think it's probably even worse now.
Well, we don't have a lot of time. So you in your article, you talk about nationalization and debt forgiveness. Talk about that.
Well, historically, Michael Hudson is the expert on this. He studied it historically, going way back into BC times, the Assyrians, the Hittites, these types of ancient civilizations. Debt would build up over time, the economy would grind to a halt, and then the ruler or the ruling establishment would simply declare debt forgiveness.
A Jubilee year, I believe.
Jubilee year. they would declare that, and then it would all start over again and go until they had to do that again. So Michael Hudson said, we have so much debt. It's not just the government debt's a problem, it's the corporate debt and the individual debt. See, when corporations use their profits and their borrowings to buy back their own stock, they're actually they're decapitalizing their own company. See, they're taking on debt in order to reduce their market value by shrinking the shares. When you buy back shares,
You mean increase the value?
It increases the value of the shares, but it decreases the value of the company.
Oh, okay.
Because if you look at the balance sheet, the debt's gone up, but they haven't used that debt to expand the productive capability of the company. They used it to increase their bonuses and produce capital gains for shareholders by driving up the price of the shares, by buying their own shares. So this is the reason the 1% has most of the gains of income and wealth. And
how does that work out with debt forgiveness and nationalization?
Right. If to forgive these debts, now these are the people who caused all the trouble. If you forgive the debts, you're simply rewarding them for doing all the wrong things. So I think it means, if the public is going to accept this and have trust in government, you have to nationalize the banks.
Nationalize the banks.
You'd have to nationalize them. You can't just bail out the people who produce all this trouble. Probably large aspects of the financial system you may have to nationalize.
But that means that the government would control it, and wouldn't that make the conservatives' heads explode?
Yeah, it would, and that's why I say, do we have the capability? Are we too bound up in ideologies and disputes to be able to solve the problem? That's the question I raised in the article that you cited.
Yeah.
And so, it'd be very difficult to do this because of all the ideologies and the weaponization of words and everything else. I mean, I've written before, Rob, about how what identity politics does is splits the community up into warring factions. And without a community, how do you function? You can't have a society if everybody hates everybody else. You can't have all these multicultural elements that are at each other's throat and have a society. So this further worsens the situation we're in.
And particularly now with this incredible crisis, like nobody in their lifetime has ever seen before, we need to come together. Do you have any ideas on how that will happen or how to make it happen?
I don't know. I don't know. When you teach hate, it's hard to recover from it. So, look, the New York Times is teaching it now. That's what the 1619 Project is about. It's to teach minorities to hate white people because of slavery. So, saying that doesn't mean I'm for slavery. It just means that I'm against teaching hate.
Yeah.
So
we need something to change now. We need a leader. We need some leaders. I was trying to think who could be appointed to take on this, who could be trusted. I thought of maybe Russell Honore, who did it for Katrina down in New Orleans. I mean, but there are not that many people who everybody would respect and give the power and trust to.
I know. I agree with you. That's why I'm nervous and concerned. The concern goes way beyond the virus. The virus is kind of a catalyst that is exploding the debt bomb, and it's exploding all the disunity that's been consciously cultivated for decades. And so I wrote a column a while back, have we sown a whirlwind? And I think that's what we've done. We've destroyed the unity. We have loaded up debt so that the 1% could accumulate almost all the gains in income and wealth. It's the financials. Let's see what a financialized economy does is it means all net discretionary income goes in fees and interest to financial systems as payment on debt service. So this is what they've done. The banking system does not serve the economy. It serves speculators. It serves buyouts. It serves financing purchases of paper assets, and it doesn't build plant and equipment, infrastructure. It doesn't do things that make a real economy grow and be productive and have productive assets.
Now you're talking about nationalizing for the purpose of debt forgiveness, right?
Well, I'm saying if you're going to forgive the debts of these big bankrupt corporations, you just about have to nationalize them. It implies nationalization. Otherwise, you're simply saying, well, we don't care. You brought this crisis on our heads. Here's all the money to get out of it. So I think it implies that there has to be an ownership change.
Now, in response to that, you talk in the article about socialist and socialism and your thoughts on that.
Well, I'm not saying you're going to have to nationalize the whole economy, but the large elements that have created the debt bomb that have to be bailed out, they have to then accept public ownership, nationalization. And but it doesn't mean the whole economy is going to be socialistic with no private property, no private businesses. A lot of the private businesses had nothing to do with building the debt time bomb. They're suffering from it too.
So you're talking about these big banks that caused the problem back in 2008, have made us more vulnerable to it right now. And basically, you're saying nationalize them, and instead of giving them the money, maybe through the banks, give credit to all the people who have accounts in those banks. I call the show the Bottom Up Show. I think that if they're going to give out $2 trillion, it should be done at the individual level so that everybody gets some money, kind of like Andrew Yang talked about, giving everybody some money, then it'll go right into the economy.
Well, right, that's true. And I'm saying you remember all the uproar from the public about the bank bailout 12 years ago or whenever it was. We don't do that again. So this time you say, well, the government is simply taking the banks over. Governments have done this before in history. Not just banks; they've taken over other kinds of corporations.
How? Who? What have they done? What are some examples of that?
Well, you're asking me things right now that I would have to go look up because I don't deal with this every day.
None of us do.
This interview came up on very short notice.
Yeah.
And but I seem to remember, was it Harry Truman or Eisenhower? Somebody threatened the steel industry with nationalization. Things like that happen in wartime. They get de facto nationalized. They may still be private, but they're not making cars, they're making jeeps and tanks. And that sort of thing, and the airline companies aren't making passenger planes, they're making bombers and jet fighters. And so it can take various forms, but what I'm talking about is just change in ownership. We can't leave the people in who built up this debt time bomb exploding on all of us for the sake of their own profits.
It's a huge revolution, like you say. Do you have any advice to people about how to deal with this economically?
I mean, you can't. The only people who could deal with this would be people with an independent farm that raise their own food and had their own fuel. But we're not that kind of society anymore. So it's going to be worse. It could be much worse than the Great Depression because then there were a lot of farms people could go back to. A lot of people in town had come off the farms. They could go home to mom and dad and grandpa and grandma. And those farms aren't there. It's commercial farming.
Yeah.
See, here's the great failure of our leadership and our capitalist economic system. It's so now everyone is so dependent on job, but the jobs are so vulnerable in a global system that you have to have widespread support systems and you have to have savings built up in the population. and they failed to do that. So for decades, the financial system has financialized the economy. That means they take all the surplus economics and puts it in their wealth. So everything's financed on debt. People live on debt. So their credit card bills, the interest are something like 19% or something, they drive their car on debt. They don't go down and buy the car. They take a loan, usually no down payment. And they don't, they technically own the car, but they don't, they own a loan.
Right.
And this type of system is extremely vulnerable. I don't think it's dawned on them yet in Washington or the Congress or anywhere. And I don't think the economists have an inkling. Bernie Sanders is the only one that even seems to be at least partially aware of these problems, at least from the standpoint of the individual not having health care, losing his job, and all of that. But who else? They don't seem to be aware.
Did you watch the debate last night?
No.
No. Yeah. Are you a Bernie supporter between the candidates?
I haven't had time to think about supporting anybody, but all I've noticed is he's the only one that addresses any central issue. Now, whether he would be able to do anything about it, I don't know. You see, our system is one that almost prevents leadership. Unlike Russia, where Putin can lead.
Yeah.
You see,
and right now we need leadership, and we also need that bottom up, everybody coming together. Both sides have to be happening. We need strong leadership at the top, and everybody has to help everybody else at the bottom.
That's right. We have to throw hate away and realize, we're all here. It's stupid to hate each other and spend your life fighting each other. Another great problem with the disunified population is it's nobody to challenge the rulers.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
we've got to wrap. This has been awesome. Any final words?
Well, I wouldn't know what else to say. When you nationalize health, you probably have to do the pharmaceutical companies. See, the pharmaceutical companies, they basically impose our approach to medicine. They impose it on the medical schools, on the practice. And so the way we practice medicine, it leaves out a lot of just natural remedies. It leaves out vitamin remedies. It leaves out other approaches because it's all fixed toward the pharmaceutical company's business model. So,
when we nationalize healthcare, we need to nationalize the pharmaceutical companies along with them, eh?
Yeah, that's for sure. It at least gives you a chance. You might get a more open approach to things. See, if pharmaceuticals are not simply profit-driven, but are driven by finding the widest range of approaches, of cures, the research and development is not along some profit line entirely.
What a novel idea. We got to wrap. So thank you so much. My guest for the show has been Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury for Economic Policy in the Reagan administration. His website is paulcraigroberts.org. Thanks so much for being back on the show.
Pleased to be with you, Rob.